After nearly 10 years, it feels fantastic to hear those words again. But here we are, ladies and gentlemen. Armored Core 6 is getting ready to launch, and I recently had a chance to go on out to California and play the entire first chapter of the game. I had a chance to try a variety of playstyles, your reverse joints, your tanks, your tetrapods, your bipedal. I had a chance to try out a bunch of different weapons, had a chance to try out the damage types, various melee weapons, some of the OS tuning upgrades, which we're going to talk about. And today I'm just going to be bringing you my impressions. So I'm allowed to share 20 minutes of footage with y'all. We're going to be looking at progression through some of the main missions as well as some boss fights, just to give you a good idea of raw gameplay with the HUD on and everything. And we're going to be talking about some of the mechanics, stuff like punishment on death and hard lock and how that all works now. Additionally, I had a chance to interview Yamamura and Ogura, the director and producer of the game. I interviewed them alongside some folks from Armored Core Legacy, so I'm going to have a separate video going up that will contain all the details from that interview. It's roughly 80 minutes long, and there's just tons and tons and tons and tons of information. So if you're looking for an even more deep dive, definitely make sure to check that out. I'll have that in like the end screen of this video. But either way, let's talk about the game. And the first thing I really want to touch on is hopefully what you're seeing in the gameplay here is just how much Armored Core this actually is. I think a lot of people were concerned that between the hard lock and the healing and the forward movement on melee and all that stuff, that this was going to kind of change what the game was and take it away from its Armored Core identity. And I think the gameplay speaks for itself here. I think this is still very much Armored Core. This does feel like a natural evolution of the franchise, like the devs suggested it would be. And I just had a ton of blast playing with it. There wasn't a moment where I was playing this where I was like, oh, well, this feels a little too casual now, or, oh, this feels too easy. It doesn't feel like I'm playing Armored Core anymore. Like, no, it definitely felt like Armored Core. It sure as hell looks like Armored Core. And more than anything, I'm just impressed the way they've implemented all these new mechanics and still managed to preserve the game's identity. So to talk a little bit about those, because there is a bunch of new stuff, we have the ACS, Assault Boost, there's Surprise Damage, we have Strain, which leads into Stagger, we have Direct Damage when you can stagger an enemy, we have Attack Indicators for certain big attacks that are incoming, and if you happen to be using a shield, there's even an initial guard system where if you time a block just perfectly, you can mitigate out a lot of the stagger damage you would take. So to talk about one of these new things, we have Assault Boost, which at first glance you think, hey, maybe this is for movement, and while you certainly can use it to traverse long distances and even dodge during it, it's meant to function more as an offensive action. The idea is while we're rushing targets with this, we're going to be doing more impact damage, we're going to be taking less impact damage, and it just works into the ebb and flow of combat, where we're rushing in on a target, we're building up that impact gauge, and eventually causing ACS strain, leading into a stagger, leading into direct damage. And this is very much kind of the ebb and flow of combat in Armored Core 6. And we actually had a chance to talk to the devs about this. Armored Core Legacy brought up a question. They said, if you think of for answered as described by one word, I think a lot of people would say speed. What are the words you would use to describe this? And they said aggression, and then later they said burst. And I think you're seeing that in the gameplay here, because we have this flowing combat now where the idea is we're circling a target, we're basically dancing with them, and we're building up that strain, we're building up that stagger gauge, and then when we see the opportunity to strike, we're rushing in and we're doing massive amounts of damage to the target, aiming to take them on down. And the thing that's really nice is this makes boss fights way more fun in this game. I remember back in the older games, boss fights were kind of a dodge fest, and they still are. You're still dodging all over the place and avoiding stuff, but one of the big changes is now with the stagger system, you're actively looking for opportunities where you can exploit the boss, and I think it creates a just much more satisfying flow to the combat after playing with it. So let's actually talk about the stagger system a little bit. So the idea is as you're doing damage to the target, certain weapons are going to build up more strain. Now there's both bursts of strain as well as strain accumulation, but the idea is as you accumulate this strain, eventually you're going to put the enemy into a stagger state, and when they're in the stagger state, their ACS is going to fail, which is going to make them drop out of the air and be briefly immobilized, and during that time, they're going to take additional damage. You're going to be able to do what's known as a direct hit. So the idea is you have weapons that are more for building up that stagger on the target, and then weapons that are really to punch the damage out after the enemy has become staggered. And on top of that, we even have surprise attacks now. So given the vastness of these levels, you could essentially loop all the way around a target, come up behind it, fill it full of bullets and missiles and whatnot, and quickly put it into a stagger state to get that massive damage and blow it on up. There are a lot of new systems they've put into place, and despite that, it doesn't feel like they've betrayed their identity at all. This still very much feels like Armored Core, and it does feel like a natural evolution of the franchise. And honestly, after going hands-on, I'm just ecstatic to play more of this. Moving on from there, I want to talk about the lock-on system now, and in particular the hard lock. So first I want to say that the traditional lock-on that you're familiar with from Armored Core is still alive and well. And for the purpose of the discussion, I'm going to refer to that as traditional lock, and then the other one, hard lock. But the idea with the traditional lock is it's almost a fusion of 4 and 5 put together. So anything that's really on our screen that our FCS can pick up, we can get the lock on, and then that is where our bullets are going to fly. On top of that, FCS is going to impact things like the range of the lock on. It's going to impact the cluster of your bullets, and so it's just as important as it has been before. Having a hard lock doesn't suddenly make the necessity of the FCS any less. It's still incredibly important, if not one of your most important components. Now, one of the big things to note is when you're using the more traditional lock-on, you still have lateral movement. So left goes left, right goes right, forward and back, all that stuff. But when you do the hard lock, your left and right change to more of a pivot. So the idea is almost when you're locked onto a target and you're hitting left, it would be like you had a rope attached to it and you're slowly swinging around it. And so it helps to keep the target more centered in your frame, but it is going to change up your movement slightly. Regardless, if you're not a fan of it, obviously the traditional lock is still here. Another thing that was noted is that the traditional lock actually has better accuracy. There was a tooltip somewhere in one of the tutorials for it. I was trying to pull a screen of it like I did the previous mechanics, but I couldn't find it. But it was noted that the traditional lock does have better accuracy. And one of the things I found myself doing a lot is as I was going through the level, I found myself using traditional lock for like 85-90% of the encounters, and then when I'd end up fighting a large target, either a boss or an enemy AC, that's where I was going for the hard lock, because at that point I wanted to focus completely on one target. I didn't want to worry about anything else or trying to keep up with it as it was turning. And so I do think there is a use case for both of them in the ecosystem of this game. I think that as people play, they're going to find there are uses for the hard lock, and then there are uses for the traditional lock. And even past that, once you unlock OS tuning, there's actually a full manual aiming mode that you could unlock to where all of your targets are going to be manually placed shots, so you could lead the target and whatnot. And so the point I want to make here is if you had concerns about the hard lock and you think the hard lock is going to compromise the game, I think they're unfounded at this point. After having a chance to play with both of them, there's going to be times where you're going to want to use traditional, and there's going to be a time where you're going to want to use hard lock. And just because you have hard lock, it's not going to make you some unstoppable monster in PvP. It is worth noting that we didn't have a chance to do PvP at the event. It was confirmed there will be 1v1s and 3v3s, but even then I brought up the example of a tank with double Gatling guns and just instantly turning to your target and how that would make you basically a god in PvP. And the devs basically said that between bullet velocity and how well you're able to keep up with certain targets and the fact that you can range break the hard lock, they ultimately don't think this is going to be a concern in PvP. Regardless, it is something they're aware of, and they did mention there will be regulation patch and updates and whatnot as the game goes throughout time. So this is something that if come launch I'm wrong and it turns out it is a problem, rest assured it'll end up getting patched. Either way, let's move on and talk about the healing and punishment on death. And right up front, I want to say that after experiencing it, I am a big fan. So if we take a look at our AP, and just with this AC and the other one I have, let's just round it and say I have 10,000. All right, the heal is worth 4,000. So either I have 10,000 and I have 3 heals for 4, or alternatively, I could just have 22,000 AP. Now the thing is, when your max is only 10,000 and you get hit with a shot that brings you down to like 2, it instantly creates a sense of urgency. It instantly makes you feel like, oh my god, I gotta get off this heal. And especially if you've been hit and you're staggered, keep in mind, when you're staggered, you're immobilized. You're dropping out of the air, you can't heal. And so that sense of urgency that's generated by having lower overall health but healing compared to just having higher health and no healing is just an absolute net positive for the game. The more I played, the more I fought with the bosses especially. I mean, there are attacks that will take 2/3 of your health away. In some cases, just kill you outright if you don't end up dodging them. And so with that, I think the healing is just, it's a net positive for the game. I know a lot of people were hesitant, but like honestly, it's nice. Moving on to talking a little bit about death and punishment. So one of the big changes now is that when we die and we're presented with a checkpoint, we now have access to assembly as well as AC data. So you could completely pull out a new armor core, or you could change up a bunch of parts. You could just change up a weapon, whatever's going to be the case. And what they basically said is as you progress through the game and you reach various checkpoints, the damage that you've taken up to that checkpoint is used what's calculating your score at that moment. So almost think of it like grades, you know, like you're going through first period, second period, third, and you get a grade for each of those periods, and then that's going to determine your overall performance for that mission. Now, simply using a heal isn't necessarily going to negatively impact your performance, but if you're using a heal, chances are you have taken more damage, and if you've taken more damage, that will negatively impact your performance. So keep in mind now that it's not necessarily the healing. Obviously the healing's fine, it's just how much damage you're going to take. And on top of that, death is just considered a singular penalty. So when you die and you get, it's like, well, you got one check mark now. It doesn't matter if you go into AC assembly or AC data, completely rebuild your AC from scratch. It still just counts as one death. There's not an additional negative for switching out parts or whatever the case is. And I do think this is something that's going to make the game a little bit more approachable for new players, just being able to switch up their builds on the fly. I definitely think it's going to be something that veterans are going to want to use. And even beyond that, even if you don't want to use that stuff, to pull off S-rank missions and get, the perfect rankings and whatnot, if you're trying to S-rank everything, you obviously still need to go through missions without dying at all. So, the whole idea of changing out your AC or going to assembly mid-mission is going to be a non-issue if you're trying to get those perfect ranks. Talking a little bit about the level and the mission design, this is something I was actually really impressed with, because from what we had seen, we only got to see that one big mission. And in the previous video I mentioned maybe they were going to go for a Neo approach where, perhaps I'm dropped back in that mission in a small area of it and I'm replaying through it with some type of sub-objective. And we do see similar locales, so there were other missions I played that were in a snowy biome like this, but they weren't in the particular area this mission took place. They were in more open zones or more standalone zones, and so they've done a really good job of mission variety. Just to briefly go through the list, I wasn't able to show every mission, but so we had our main missions, obviously. We had like a cleanup mission where I was sent to just go in and take out some enemies or take out artillery. There was one where I had to take down a transport helicopter. There was a one-on-one where I was just fighting another pilot. We had the tutorial missions, which were really cool. That's where I pulled those screens for, and that's something that's going to be huge. There are progressive tutorial missions that you unlock. So there was one for basic controls, combat fundamentals, assembling your AC, reverse joins, tetrapods, tanks, and then a advanced merc certification, which basically was just you fighting different ACs with your build to see how successful it was. And then after that, you unlock the arena mode, which was going to put you against other combatants, and completing arena mode missions was going to unlock the chips that you used to make changes to your AC with OS tuning, which we'll be talking about later. I know I've mentioned that a few times now. But so there's a really nice variety of missions, and one of the biggest things is we can replay missions at any time. If you want to redo a story mission, you just jump right back in. You can still earn money from it, you can get a higher grade on it. Don't know if New Game Plus is actually confirmed, but I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be, just based on how things are currently designed. But either way, I can already see myself just replaying certain missions. And on top of that, they mentioned that there are going to be unique or hidden weapons that we'll be able to find. So there could be weapons sitting in a equipment chest or a bunker somewhere throughout a mission. So exploration in these large missions is definitely going to be something that people are going to want to do. And I can already tell, just with the amount of verticality we have, I'm going to be combing through maps on my first playthrough to try and find stuff. And another thing on that note is, I know people have been wondering about like the various checkpoints, like the restock where you heal up, you get all your ammo. And I think it's important to note that the main missions especially are much, much longer than what we were used to in the previous games. I think in the previous games it very much felt like you were going down a checklist. And some of these missions here, you're transitioning between multiple areas, multiple objectives. Eventually they're going to culminate in a boss fight. And so we're talking like 20, 30-minute long primary missions where the one you're seeing right now, for example, we went through this whole sector. We got into a new sector where there was an ambush, there was an interior section, and then eventually we made our way up to the boss fight, which the boss fight in and of itself took quite a bit of time. And typically these checkpoints are going to be before a boss, but they definitely felt necessary given the progression. I will say that even without the restocks, I didn't experience a time where I particularly felt low on ammo. At the same time, obviously, we only had limited weapons available to us since we were on the first chapter. There were quite a lot, and I am going to have a section at the end of the video where I just go through everything I unlocked, so you can kind of just grab information, basically an information dump, if you will. But as I played through, I didn't feel particularly starved for ammo on these missions. And even with this current setup, I was a tank running a laser cannon and plasma missiles on the shoulders, and then I had a grenade launcher and a bazooka. So the idea is I'd get the stagger between the laser cannon and the bazooka, fire off the grenade launcher, get big damage. You weren't really hitting the grenade launcher otherwise. The trajectory on it was quite slow. But even then, I only had, I think, like 100 shots in the bazooka, and that was more than enough that I was like, I'm cruising through this. I'm going to blow my way through everything that gets in my way. Just absolutely decimate enemies. This was actually a really fun build to play with. I mean, it was, if you could have a strength build in Armored Core, this was the strength build. This thing was absolutely devastating. I also had a chance to ask if there were going to be any high-ruble mercenaries or UNACs in this game, so you could have, even if it's an AI companion, and they confirmed that is not going to be the case. There's certain missions where you'll have a companion with you for a set amount of time, but the focus here is on the single-player experience, and they definitely crafted something that's really nice here. When I think back to my time with 5 and Verdict Day, the most memorable parts of it were the PvP, And the campaign very much felt like I'm just running through missions to get money, to get parts, and that was it. Whereas the PvP was what I enjoyed so much, and here it feels like they've taken so much care in crafting these missions that even after I'm done them, I could see myself going back through and replaying missions with different AC setups simply because of what an enjoyable experience they are. So moving on from there, I want to take some time to talk about boss fights and one of the new mechanics that I really got a feel for in the boss fights, and that is charge attacks. So to briefly touch on charge attacks, this is something that you were probably familiar with if you had previously played thermal weapons, which, by the way, we still have 3 different damage types. They're now energy, explosive, and kinetic. But so 3 damage types, 3 types of defense. Obviously, certain weapons are better for impact damage, whereas others are better for pure damage. But the point being, charging weapons was something that previously was basically thermal only, and now we actually have that on a variety of weapons. Not every single one of them, but for example, I had a battle rifle that was single shot, and then when I charged it, I would do a 3-round burst, and that's actually what I was using in this fight here. What was interesting was, because I was a bipedal, I went into a ready stance before I would fire this off. So what I had to do was basically get above the tank, have the rifle charged, be in hard lock on, and then as I knew the tank was about to dash, I'd preemptively fire my shot. My AC would turn, and it would unleash the shots at just the right sweet spot to hit the engine in the back of the tank. And as I was playing, for a moment, I was like, man, this fucking tank is so tedious. But in retrospect, it was actually a really good learning experience about like pre-firing those shots and looking for the opportunity. And if you're running a tank, you don't need to worry about this. Tetrapods actually have a hover functionality now, so while they're in the air hovering, they don't have that ready stance. But it's definitely interesting from a mechanical perspective, where you're able to put out more damage and more stagger by doing those charge shots, but knowing that you're going to have the right opportunity to use them. The boss fights in general, though, I know a lot of people were worried that the bosses would feel too soulsy. I don't really think that was the case here. There were obvious telegraphs that you had to dodge and opportunities to get damage in, but the main emphasis on boss fights here is building up that stagger gauge and going for the direct hit. But taking Ire as an example here, you can see there's a lot going on. I'm trying to get within range of it to avoid the missiles. I'm trying to get through its shield. It has assault armor, which I need to be wary of. It has a Gatling gun. Later on, it has like a secondary phase where it pulls out a flamethrower, so you need to be aware of that. And so there's a lot of different things going on in this fight, and you're trying to keep all of that in mind while also being mindful of the stagger gauge and when you have opportunities to do big damage. And I really think we're just seeing FromSoft's boss design in all of its glory here. I mean, these were not slow-paced, methodical fights whatsoever. Obviously, you see us dashing in, boss popping assault armor to knock me back away. And, even just a little bit here, it should be like right around here. Yeah, here we go. Boss gets ready to missile. I use assault armor myself, blow those missiles away, re-push the boss into stagger. And I think this just goes back to early in the video where I talked about aggression being a mainstay of this game. There is just, I mean, God, these fights are wild, man. And like, honestly, what's crazy to me is this is the final boss of the first chapter of the game. So if this is the quality of boss we're getting at the start of the game, and this is how wild things are, you know it's going to only get more insane from here. Like, FromSoft never gets more tame with their bosses. So honestly, I can't wait to see what else we have in store, because this fight was absolutely just a blast to overcome and just try and push this thing through, especially because I knew I was fighting it on a time limit, and I'm just excited to see what else they have in store for us. So since I only have about a minute and a half left to talk, the last thing I want to touch is customization, because I know a lot of people have been curious to what level we have customization, and we have all of it, baby. We have full emblem creation. You can put emblems on your AC. You can change the color of individual parts. You can change the quality of the part, whether it's like rusty or pristine. You can change the gloss on certain parts, and they really went all out. They literally everything when it comes to designing your AC that you may have been fond of in previous games is alive and well here. Another big thing with customization is the OS tuning system, which we're finally going to talk about. As opposed to tuning individual parts, as we complete arena missions, we now gain access to OS chips, and we're able to use these chips to unlock specific upgrades. In some cases, actual core expansions, stuff like Assault Armor or the Quick Turn or the Boost Kick, and in other cases, just outright upgrades, such as power optimization or damage tuning. On top of that, even though it was only the first chapter of the game, as you can see, there is a huge variety of weapons and parts that we were able to choose from by the time we were done that first chapter. And that's really what I wanted to show at the end of this video. I know a lot of people have been really curious, you know, what level of customization we're still going to have. And so I really just wanted to scroll through everything and let y'all grab screenshots and basically information dump, because honestly, this is shaping up to be the best armored core we have ever had a chance to experience. And before we wrap up, let me just give y'all one last juicy clip. Damn, that looked good.